Dr. J here again. Welcome back to part 3. We ended our part 2 with the question, is there more to human learning than simply responding to a stimulus? And I think you know the answer to that. Absolutely, like choosing whether or not to attend class. We don't normally think of going to class as a reflex. We think of it as a free choice, and whether you continue this behavior depends on the consequences after going to class or not going to class. Welcome to part 3 of Chapter 5 on learning, featuring operant conditioning. And the key terms in this lesson include operant conditioning as well as positive reinforcements, primary and secondary reinforcers, negative reinforcement, and continuous reinforcement. B.F. Skinner is to operant conditioning as Ivan Pavlov is to classical conditioning. Skinner demonstrated the principles of operant conditioning through laboratory research on animals including rats and pigeons. It was his contention that operant conditioning could also help us understand a great deal about human behavior. We will define operant conditioning as a type of learning in which the consequences of a behavior are manipulated so as to increase or decrease the frequency of behavior in the future. There are two types of basic consequences to any behavior: reinforcement and punishment. If good things happen after a behavior, it will increase or continue, and we call that reinforcement. But on the other hand, if bad things happen after a behavior, it will stop or decrease, and we call this punishment. Now, before we go any further, who manipulates these consequences of reinforcement and punishment? The most influential dispenser of reinforcement and punishment, particularly in the early years for all of us, is our parents. Teachers give out plenty of reinforcement and punishment too, don't they? Coaches definitely control consequences to their athletes' behaviors. Bosses and supervisors manage these at work. And perhaps the most frequent dispenser of consequences is you and me, to our friends and most closest relationships. There are two types of reinforcement: positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. We'll define positive reinforcement as the addition of a pleasant or desirable consequence following a behavior, and it increases the chance that that behavior will repeat. Let me go over a couple of examples for us. These girls are studying for a big test. What is a pleasant and desirable consequence following this behavior that would increase the chance the behavior will continue in the future? Good grades, of course. Good grades positively reinforces study behavior, so they're likely to study again for the next test. This gal here is practicing to be the best basketball player she can be. What is a pleasant and desirable consequence following this behavior that would increase the chance the behavior will continue in the future? Success, of course. Winning positively reinforces practice so that she and the other gals are likely to practice again for the next game. Pleasant and desirable consequences that follow a behavior are known as reinforcers, and they come in two major varieties: primary and secondary. I'll go over each one. Primary reinforcers fulfill a basic need for survival, and they're not learned. We come wired that way. They're called primary because they come first, and they are most important for staying alive. These include food and water. Think about this. If a person is hungry and thirsty enough, we can positively reinforce just about any behavior with those primary reinforcers. Secondary reinforcers fulfill a social need, and they are learned through association with other reinforcers. They're called secondary because they come second and are not as crucial for survival. But it's important to remember, after primary needs are satisfied, secondary reinforcers can have powerful effects. And these include attention, praise, recognition. So with operant conditioning, we've covered positive reinforcement, which is pretty straightforward and easy to understand. Now it's time to move on to negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is defined as the termination of an unpleasant or undesirable state following a behavior, and it has the effect of increasing the chance that that behavior will repeat. Now, remember, very important, negative reinforcement increases a behavior. This is not punishment. Punishment decreases a behavior, and I'll talk about that in our fourth segment. People get these very confused and mixed up. Lay people will use the word negative reinforcement to mean punishment, but strictly speaking, they are different as night and day. Here's a couple of examples. When is the last time you experienced the unpleasant and undesirable state known as a headache? I hope it wasn't recently. What kind of behavior would remove this unpleasant and desirable and undesirable state, and thus increase the chance that that behavior will increase in the future? Think about that. What's the most common thing people do? Taking a headache medicine. The termination of headache pain negatively reinforces taking medicine so that you're likely to take an aspirin again for the next headache. However, not everything that works by negative reinforcement is good for us in the long run. I want you to consider this example. Our gal here suffers from crippling social anxiety, and she gets physically sick at the thought of going to a social event and meeting new people. She's experiencing an unpleasant and undesirable state, obviously. What is a behavior that some people do to remove this distress and increase the chance that that behavior will increase in the future? Drinking alcohol. The termination of social distress negatively reinforces drinking alcohol so that she and anybody else is likely to drink again for the next party. A lot of alcohol abuse develops through the process of negative reinforcement, and down at the clinic we call this self-medication. Remember, positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement always increase the behavior. Punishment decreases the behavior. Now, to finish out this section, let me begin talking about schedules of reinforcement. At an ATM machine, when you enter your password, you'll get your cash back. It does not matter when you last used the machine. It does not matter how many times in a row you do this. If you go through the correct steps, the machine will give you positive reinforcement in the form of cash every time, day or night. This is known as continuous reinforcement, and we define it as when reinforcement occurs after every behavior. Do you think continuous reinforcement is commonly used in real life? Well, think of this. Can a parent give positive reinforcement to a child every time she exhibits good behavior? No. Can a boss give positive reinforcement to an employee every time she's being productive? Of course not. As a practical matter, no one has the time or the resources to do this. But it turns out in operant conditioning, we don't have to provide continuous reinforcements. We can provide partial or intermittent reinforcement. And that's where we pick up on part 4 on partial reinforcement schedules and then finish up with punishment. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.